is that we must, under no circumstances, re-embrace policies of protectionism. And the way in which the experience of my own country in the last decade, particularly in its interaction with the countries of North Asia, with Japan and with Korea and with China, three nations that have been wonderful customers of Australia, and three nations with which we have very close and abiding economic relationships as well as political relationships, albeit of a different kind, because in the case of Japan and Korea, it is a relationship built on common democratic principles. In the case of China, it is a relationship which is built on an acceptance that our political and cultural systems are very different, but that nonetheless should not stand in the way of a productive relationship between our two countries. But our experience, and I believe the experience of those three countries, means very strongly that openness in trading policies is quite fundamental. The last issue I want to touch on very briefly, and it would be unrealistic speaking here in Korea without saying something, of course, about relations between the North and the South on the Korean Peninsula. As a country that had an historic involvement with Korea and the defence of South Korea in the 1950s, I am very conscious, as a former Australian Prime Minister, as all Australians are, of the history of this peninsula. Let me say that I support very strongly the stance that has been taken by the new President of your own country in relation to his dealings with North Korea. I find the aspirations, the nuclear aspirations of North Korea as unacceptable. They were unacceptable in the eyes of the government that I led, and they remain unacceptable in the eyes of the government which succeeded mine in Australia. We remain very strongly committed to resolving this issue through the processes of the United Nations, the maintenance of sanctions, the application of further ones if that is deemed appropriate, and also, of course, through the agency of the six-party discussions. Those who suggest that the matter should be entirely resolved between the United States and North Korea misunderstand, and I don't need to remind a Korean audience of this, misunderstand the vital interests of countries such as Korea and Japan in the resolution of this issue. And they also completely misunderstand and ignore the reality that of all the nations in the world, despite anything it may say to the contrary, China has more potential influence on North Korea than any other participant. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank the organisers of this forum for the honour that it's done me inviting me to participate. The region in which we live, of course, is the fastest growing in the world. And in the past year, there have been many false comparisons made between the global economic plunge that we've experienced and the experience of the Great Depression. Although there's always a tendency for political leaders and plenty of economists as well to draw those comparisons, I think they have been overdone. And once again, drawing on the contribution of an American academic to this forum, he made the rather pithy comment that the global economic downturn has produced a veritable industry of comparisons with the circumstances of the Great Depression. Those comparisons have been overdone. Those comparisons are largely invalid, not entirely invalid. And in one respect, they are manifestly invalid. And that, of course, is that in the 1930s, the centre of gravity of the world economy was North America and Europe. And we all know now that in the first part of the 21st century, whilst Europe and North America remain very, very significant, the centre of gravity is, if it has not shifted, it is moving inexorably to our part of the world. It's moving to the region in which we live, in which my country exists, moving to the region where Korea is very much part and parcel of the epicentre of that region. So forums of this kind, perspectives produced by forums of this kind in relation to the economic and political future of the world are therefore even more important than they would have been some years ago. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Prime Minister Howard, for presenting your insightful views on the regional structure and the evolving changes in the Asia-Pacific region and also inter-Korean relationship and China's role in persuading North Korea. We will discuss the issues that have been raised in your presentation later. Next is our second distinguished speaker, former Prime Minister Lee Hong-go. Prime Minister.
I would like to welcome my friend, Prime Minister John Howard, and others from abroad. I think we Koreans are extremely envious of the fact that Prime Minister Howard served for 12 years as a Prime Minister. In our country, even our President couldn't serve more than 5 years, not to mention the Prime Ministers and Ministers. So this is something I think we have to think about. As Dr. Park said, I taught political science for a long time at the university, and I actually have many of my former students sitting out there. So my talk may sound a bit professorial, but please excuse me. Now the main topic for this conference is the shaping a new regional governance for East Asia. My main argument this morning is that it's about time we have to shift our emphasis from nation building to community building. I think for nearly 60 years, certainly since the end of the Second World War, particularly in Asia, we concentrated on nation building. Many countries in the region were former colonies, therefore it's natural that we are trying to build new nation. China had a very difficult period, so actually they are building new nation in the traditional Middle Kingdom. Japan had an imperial setup, but after 1945, to become a democratic nation, it also engaged in nation building. So it's quite natural that we paid more attention to nation building than anything else. Therefore, the key words we used in the last 50 years or so, the terms like modernization, industrialization, democratization, even globalization, these were all connected to nation building and basically thought in terms of nation state, not so much in terms of community. But we have to now understand that perhaps world is going through a very important period of transition in the last few years and maybe in the next few years. In old days, we were coming out of so-called age of imperialism, age of ideology. Now we are entering into what you may call the era of global neighborhood. So we have to make a major adjustment. And I'm trying to say that the community building has to proceed simultaneously at three levels: national level, regional level, and global level. So these are my arguments, and let me try to make a few points along this line. Now, in modern times, we concentrated our thinking primarily on state, as I said. But in long human history, if you look back, it was society or community which preceded state. Only after you have some sort of a neighborhood and community, you began to develop a state. So in the dimension of time, we have to say society had a precedent over the state, or primacy over the state. And even on a normative dimension, you could say that the values developed in each community and society were more essential and more primary than the values artificially created by states. So these are some of the thinking underlying my argument. Now, in case of Korea, the term community building has special importance. For in 1945, we were liberated from the Japanese colonial rule. But at the same time, we found ourselves being divided into two halves, North and South, by the victorious Allied powers. And that division is lasting even up to today, so we are now in the 64th year of the division. Perhaps the Korean case is the last remain unresolved problem coming out of Second World War. Naturally, we always think of building a unified nation state on the Korean Peninsula. In fact, since 1910, when we were taken over by Japan, Koreans had not experienced living in a unified, independent state. So we like to build a unified, independent state. But at the same time, now we have to think about this endeavor in terms of how are we going to build a unified, single community or society on the peninsula. The question is, how are we going to do it? Now, this year marks the 20th anniversary of 1989 proposal called the Korean Commonwealth Unification Formula. Now let me explain just a little bit about this. In 1988-89, we were beginning to witness the end of the Cold War. And at the same time, in Korea, we had a transition from so-called authoritarian government to democracy. So realizing the fact that the Cold War was coming to an end, and within ourselves we find out a democratic society, we wanted to formulate a new unification formula which will fit into the new setting. Not the Cold War confrontation, but going over that confrontation, how are we going to maintain peace, at the same time develop a positive move toward unification. Basically, the conclusion we reached after very extensive discussion was that perhaps community building should go before a state building. In short, a unified Korean state building may take a long time. But in the meantime, we shouldn't wait that long in building a unified Korean community or Korean society on the peninsula. Or to put it more simply, one society, two-state solution was envisioned. Now this formula, which was approved by our National Assembly and duly declared as our former national unification formula, was very important, not only because of its final form, but the process which it produced this formula. We elected a new president at the end of 1987, and in 1988 election, the opposition parties won the election overwhelmingly. So National Assembly was controlled by the opposition parties, not the ruling party. Under those circumstances, the National Assembly took the leadership and presided a very extensive hearings, and for many weeks, people and leaders from all walks of life and different organizations had a chance to express their views. Concurrently throughout the country, universities and civic organizations, they had also very extensive debates. So the Korean Community National Unification Plan was a sort of synthesis or integration of all these views, and it passed National Assembly with the support of all the parties. And if I may say so, that formula is still today our official unification formula for the Republic of Korea. For some reason, and perhaps North Koreans also understood the changing international scene with the end of Cold War, they were willing to cooperate. So in 1991, after an extensive North-South meetings, we were able to sign so-called the Basic Agreement, whereby North and South had formed a joint commission on society, on culture, on economy, on military, and so on. In short, two state structures agreed to cooperate to form a single community or single society. On top of that, at the end of 1991, North Korea and South Korea signed a joint declaration to keep the Korean Peninsula nuclear free. The logic was really simple. The best way to ensure the safety of 70 million Koreans on the Korean Peninsula is not to have nuclear weapon on this peninsula. North Korea agreed. And those agreements still stand. And this is what we have to keep in mind. Now, we were somewhat overly optimistic in those few years, 1989, 1990, 91, even up to 92, because we felt that all these efforts to build a national community on our peninsula was very much in accordance with a global trend, a global effort to build a global community. In the 1970s and certainly in the 1980s, there were notable efforts to move toward a global community. You might remember three independent commissions Brandt Commission, headed by the late Chancellor Willy Brandt, to narrow the gap between rich countries and poor countries if we were going to build a global community. Again, there was a Palme Commission headed by late Prime Minister Palme of Sweden. This was to reduce arms and to get rid of the danger of nuclear armament. And finally, there was a Brundtland Commission, which was most successful venture, calling attention to the dangers facing human beings, humankind on the environmental front. And these commissions produced a successor commission in 1990 called Commission on Global Governance under the leadership of Prime Minister Ingvar Carlsson of Sweden. And that commission produced a report in 1993 in preparation for the 50th anniversary of the United Nations. And that report called Our Global Neighborhood. In short, the world is becoming a single neighborhood. So this reflected a kind of optimism prevailing in the world. But it didn't last very long. It became rather apparent that still the relations among the states, the conflicts of interest among the states were such that perhaps the dream of building a global community was somewhat premature. Then we came to the realization that perhaps more realistic move was to concentrate on building a regional community. Because given the geographic proximity and the cultural affinity, it would be much more natural and reasonable to concentrate our effort to building regional neighborhood, regional community. So we will see in the 90s and in the first part of the 21st century various efforts to build a regional community in Asia, particularly in East Asia. Prime Minister Howard mentioned APEC, which is a more larger community building scheme. There were a number of proposals for East Asian community and others. And also we were fortunate to have a successful model to benchmark the European Union. The European Union in the 90s and in early 21st century showed that a neighborhood or region could successfully integrate itself into a single community. Again, may I emphasize the term community, not necessarily a state. And our effort to move toward the regional community in East Asia got tremendous boost from the Chinese decision, and rather historic decision, to develop the country through market economy. By opening up Chinese economy and Chinese society to the neighborhood and to the world, both economic and social development in China, as well as the development of East Asian community, could make a progress. So we have various institutional community building work which we have witnessed in the last few years. We can easily cite such institutions like ASEAN Plus 3, make 16. And I think the current financial crisis had clearly demonstrated the importance of this type of community building in our region. The Chiang Mai Initiative and the various swap agreements we had witnessed in last year or so clearly testify to the importance of this arrangement. Yesterday we had a very good session on the need to build a new international architecture for financial cooperation and monetary cooperation, and also the importance of G20 in facilitating all this progress. I see all these developments in terms of national community building, regional community building, which also become a very vital part of global community building. So all in all, I'm rather hopeful that in the next few years we'll see a tremendous progress in all three fronts. As long as we adhere to the principle of openness, fairness, and human security, I think we can make Asia truly a great communal neighborhood in the world. And as again, my friend Prime Minister Howard said, together with the European community and our friends in Americas, we can play a very decisive role in building a global community in the next few years. It is in that spirit I welcome the work of our forum in Jeju Island, and I think our discussions today and tomorrow will make a significant contribution to these efforts. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister Lee Hong-gu. Both of the speakers this morning certainly expressed a cautious optimism, in my view, on the evolving regional structure and mutual benefits and common prosperity in this region, and also the future of the Korean Peninsula in terms of the changing relationship between two Koreas. Let me start with some questions and discussions on the main issues raised by former Prime Minister John Howard. You mentioned that Korea is an excellent example of the success story of the globalization and open markets. And I agree with you on that point. But at the same time, globalization inevitably brings about benefits and burdens on many countries. Burdens in terms of disparity of wealth and digital divides and so on. So I think that's one of the reasons, and together with the occurrence of the global financial crisis, that the G20 mechanism was devised to deal with the global problems on a global scale. And Korea and Australia are very active members of this G20 management operation to improve the economic financial situation and to create a new world economic order. I'd like to ask my questions to Prime Minister Howard. What is your prospect of the future of the G20 in the global village, and also the future of the Korea-Australian cooperation in the G20 process?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I think G20 is the right body to, I guess, increasingly occupy the centre stage when it comes to pooling experiences and pooling activity in relation to the world economy. Apart from anything else, it includes both Korea and Australia. And that's something that commends it very warmly to everybody in this audience, I hope. But equally, of course, it includes India and China and Brazil. It's a wider body than the G8, but it's still of a manageable size. All of my experience in government told me that once you got a body that had more than about 18 or 20 people in it, ergo 18 or 20 nations, it began to become unmanageable unless you could subdivide it into smaller units. We know that from the experience of some of the huge multilateral organisations. G8's too small, it's too narrowly focused, it's too steeped in history and doesn't recognise the developing and powerful economic engines of the world in this part of the world. So overwhelmingly, the G20 is the organisation. As far as relations between Australia and Korea are concerned, I mean, because of our middle power status, because of the way in which we have been able to complement each other's economic growth over the last several decades, we are a natural fit. I guess many of you in the audience will know that Australia and Korea and the Philippines have comprised a constituency in the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank for years. And we've also comprised, certainly Korea and Australia have, I'm not sure about the Philippines, comprised a constituency in the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which grew out of the collapse of the Soviet Empire more than 20 years ago. So Australia and Korea have a lot of happy experiences of working together in these international bodies, and I think from obviously different perspectives, but from a lot of common and beneficial experience, we can make a very good contribution to the G20, and it certainly was a body that my government gave a lot of impetus to, and equally it's a body that my successor has given a lot of impetus to. So I think it's the natural, it gets the balance right. It includes the big countries, the powerful economies that are not part of the G8, but it also is not so big as to become just a talk fest. I mean, all of these international meetings have an element of that in them, but the bigger they are, the harder they are to control and articulate a proper outcome.
Korea is now a member of the Troika, the steering management committee of the G20 process. And I think that there is a growing momentum for this G20 to tackle the global problems on a global scale. And I hope that this momentum can grow together with the Australian cooperation and participation.